This is the Cold War to 9/11, Political Science 2307 for the fall of 2020. This first lecture is called The New World Order, and this section is called Starting at the End, September 11th, 2001. Now overall, I have the ambition to investigate and critique events and theories related to the origins and development of the Cold War over this semester. What is the Cold War? It is the historical stalemate between two rivals, the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry dominated international relations and global politics for most of the second half of the 20th century. So this semester we are going to weigh how the Cold War began soon after World War II and how it played out over the next 45 years. We're going to study theories, reasons, and events during the Cold War, how it ended in 1990, and then we're going to look at the period between the end of the Cold War to the September 11th attacks in 2001. Now, as shocking as the attacks were, I'm going to argue today that they were an extension or fallout of events that occurred decades before, when the Americans were still fighting the Soviets for global supremacy. Now, in order to make this argument, I'm going to briefly touch upon various important historical events, many of which we will discuss in much more detail later in the course. For now, let's just get into our subject for section 1. I've titled this section, Starting at the End, September 11th, 2001, because as this title indicates, the 9/11 terrorist attacks are the end of our study, which will more or less be chronological. But in this first lecture, I want to begin by starting at the end, so to speak, to give you a sense of my approach to studying the Cold War, as well as foreign policy and international relations more broadly. What I hope to show is that by analyzing and understanding important historical events, we can better understand recent and contemporary politics, even giving us some sense where global politics is heading in the future. Now, let's just take a look at that day, September 11th. Like most people who are alive and old enough to remember September 11th, 2001, that day is burned into my mind. On that morning, I was actually getting ready to start a new job at a university in Alberta. My wife told me that morning that there was a news report that a plane had crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers. No doubt that caught my attention, but I was somewhat distracted that morning and I assumed it was just a terrible accident. So I headed off to work, trying to concentrate on my first lecture, which coincidentally or ironically was about international relations. I was trying to explain global politics to second-year political science students. Now, during the drive to campus, I was listening to the news and learned that a second plane had hit the second tower of the World Trade Center, and then I quickly realized that it was no accident. This video provides a timeline of events archived of what happened that morning. I warn you that some of the footage is disturbing.
American 11, are you trying to call?
The cockpit is not answering their phone. Our number 1 has been staffed and our 5 has been staffed.
Hey, I'm going to call from Washington. I am in a situation with American 11, a possible hijack.
What's going on, Betty? The crap is erratic again. Problem, very erratic. Betty, talk to me. Betty, are you there? Betty? Betty?
The plane just hit the World Trade Center.
What?
The 737.
Hey, what?
The World Trade
Who are you
Center.
talking to?
Oh, God. Oh, my God.
United 175, New York. We have some problems over here right now. We might have a hijack over here, 2 of them.
Jules, this is Ryan. Listen, on an airplane that's been hijacked. If things will go well, I'm looking good. I just want you to know I absolutely love you. I want you to do good. So happy to find. Same to my parents and everybody. And I just totally love you, and I'll see you later. Bye, Dave.
Look down!
Oh my God, so both towers are now.
Okay, I got an aircraft 6 miles east of the White House.
Hello?
Crystal City, just north of Crystal City.
Just to the north of your town.
Yeah, stop all departures.
Pentagon just got hit. No for CNN. God damn, I can't even protect my NCA.
United 93, that traffic for you is 1 o'clock, 12 miles eastbound 370.
Negative contact, we're looking, United 93.
United 93, Cleveland, if you hear the center ident.
I got the pistol down. Keep remaining steady. You have the ball board.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
We're 56865. We have, I believe it is a Boeing 757. Can you see him up there, sir?
That's confirmed. It looks like he's rocking his wings.
Roger.
He's rocking back and forth.
We're 56865. I advise you stay away from that aircraft. Go north as fast as you can.
United 93. Have you got information on that yet?
Yeah, he's down.
He's down?
Yes.
When did he land?
He did not land.
Oh, he's down?
Yes,
Down?
somewhere up northeast of Camp David.
Sean, it's me. I just want to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building in New York. There's lots of smoke, and I just wanted you to know that I love you always.
At number 2 World Trade Center, right. Lady was stewardess in this office. We're not ready to die, but it's getting bad.
I'm on the 83rd floor. I'm gonna die, aren't I? No. Say I'm gonna die.
Ma'am, say your prayers.
God.
We're gonna think positive because you gotta help each other get off the floor.
I'm
Now,
gonna die.
A new type of war. That's what it is.
By the time I arrived on campus, it was my students who told me that a plane had also hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., that both of the Trade Center towers had collapsed and killed thousands of people, and another plane crashed southeast of Pittsburgh in a field. The 9/11 Commission, which was convened to study how the September 11th attacks were planned and perpetrated, concluded that that last plane's target was either the United States Capitol building, where Congress sits, or the White House in Washington, D.C., where the president lives. I've included a copy of the commission report in the description below. In the days and weeks that followed the attacks, we learned what had likely occurred. A simple but audacious plan hatched by the international terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda. Foreign Policy magazine provides a good short history of the organization, going all the way back to 1988. Now, I should say that war, conflict, and violence have been constants in international relations. But this attack seemed to shatter the calm and optimism indicative of the previous decade. After the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, when the United States became the world's sole superpower, the economic, diplomatic, and unrivaled leader of the political world on the planet. Their new sole superpower status was made clear to the world during the Persian Gulf War, which began in August of 1990 when the Iraqi regime, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded and occupied the neighboring country of Kuwait. In early 1991, the United States, with the endorsement of the United Nations, decided to deploy their unrivaled military might to come to the aid of the oil-rich and strategically important country of Kuwait, trying to expel the Iraqi occupiers. This, again, was the beginning of the Persian Gulf War, or what President George H.W. Bush called at the time the New World Order. Here is the president announcing Operation Desert Storm, an American-led military operation to expel occupying Iraqi forces from Kuwait.
This is an historic moment. We have in this past year made great progress in ending the long era of conflict and Cold War. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
In a matter of weeks, 43 days as a matter of fact, the United States, along with 39 coalition partners, including Canada, decimated the Iraqi military, ending the occupation. Understandably, this overwhelming and decisive victory achieved almost everything the Americans wanted and highlighted their dominant American military. It suggested that no one would ever challenge the United States again. However, like all things in politics and international relations, things eventually changed. It wasn't as if the 9/11 attacks actually represented a fundamental threat to the dominance of the United States, but that is not what terrorism is designed to do. Rather than threaten the safety of a country as a whole, invade and occupy it, or defeat its military on the battlefield, terrorism is about stoking fear and provoking a reaction. And in a sense, the 9/11 terrorists achieved their aims. The United States, after the attacks, shifted their foreign policy focus dramatically. Rather than a new world order created with the support of the international community, they would instead engage in a war on terror, often going it alone and in deep disagreement with historical allies. This then laid the foundation for two 21st century wars. The war in Afghanistan, starting in 2001, in direct response to the 9/11 attacks, and the war in Iraq, beginning in 2003. Broadly speaking, these expensive and protracted wars resulted in a precipitous decline of American influence and power. Their prestige that they gained so highly had disappeared. Like the Vietnam War before, these wars turned into quagmires. Now, while it's up for debate, this decline has seen, in fact, new rivals come in the 21st century, most notably China competing for influence and power. Still, according to the President of the United States at the time of the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq were all connected and all justified as a response to the 9/11 attacks. As he explained on the evening of September 11th in hastily prepared remarks,
"We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them."
And further clarified in another speech to the joint meeting of Congress on September 20th,
"The United States respects the people of Afghanistan. After all, we are currently its largest source of humanitarian aid, but we condemn the Taliban regime. It is not only repressing its own people, it is threatening people everywhere by sponsoring and sheltering and supplying terrorists. By aiding and abetting murder, the Taliban regime is committing murder."
These are the key points that the United States used to justify the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, a poor country with a small military with little direct involvement in the 9/11 attacks. And despite this, the United Nations and the international community still authorized the American-led war, at least initially. This was a bit of a surprise because Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter is not really designed to authorize retaliation against a shadowy terrorist network that has no sovereign territory or a traditional military fighting another on a battlefield. The UN Security Council is empowered by Chapter 7 to respond to, quote, threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. So, for example, in 1990, the Security Council passed Resolution 660 and 678, invoking Chapter 7 of the Charter, and demanded that Iraq withdraw immediately and unconditionally all of its forces out of Kuwait. When Saddam Hussein refused, military action against the Iraqi forces in Kuwait went forward with the full support of the international community. But in this instance, in the war in Afghanistan, it was not the Afghani military or government that executed 9/11, the attacks. Instead, it was this shadowy Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, these Islamic fundamentalists that came to govern much of Afghanistan around 1996, were merely accused of harboring or aiding and abetting Al-Qaeda and their leader, Osama bin Laden. In essence, giving the terrorist organization safe haven to plan and train for the terrorist attacks. It was Al-Qaeda, not the Taliban, that organized and perpetrated the 9/11 attacks, yet the American argument prevailed. The United Nations authorized the United States and its coalition partners, including Canada, to retaliate against and topple the Taliban government, in essence endorsing the military invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. The Security Council, the UN body responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, adopted Resolution 1378, condemning the Taliban for allowing Afghanistan to be used as a base for the export of terrorism by the Al-Qaeda network and other terrorist groups, and for providing safe haven to Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and others associated with them. And in this context, supporting the efforts of the Afghan people to replace the Taliban regime. While the Taliban were quickly removed from Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, it was by no means a swift and easy victory, as was the case during the Persian Gulf War. Instead, the U.S. has, to this day, maintained a large presence in the country, costing much blood and treasure, and this has gone on for the last 2 decades. Furthermore, the Taliban never disappeared or disbanded. To this day, they continue to fight, and by some estimates, will one day rule Afghanistan again. Take a look at this timeline prepared by the Council of Foreign Relations for more details. But where did the Taliban come from? Who are they, and why did they provide safe haven for Al-Qaeda? To understand the origins and development of the Taliban, we have to consider another pivotal event in international relations from decades earlier, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which started in 1979. Local resistance fighters, called the Afghan Mujahideen, which is Arabic for fighters engaged in a holy war or jihad, quickly organized to fight the Soviet Red Army. Now here is where the United States, influenced by Cold War politics and ideology, made a fateful decision. Through various covert operations led by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, they decided to fund and arm these Mujahideen fighters because they were worried that the Soviets consolidated their control of Afghanistan, they would use it to continue to push their troops further into the Middle East and Asia, eventually threatening the Persian Gulf and other important areas, strategic areas. Therefore, the Cold War battle between the United States and the Soviet Union was the initial context for America to provide this covert support to a ragtag group of fighters dubbed the Mujahideen. At the time, it of course made sense for the United States to fund and arm this group, as they were motivated by common efforts to stop the Soviets. But what they perhaps didn't fully understand or appreciate is that this same group was also motivated by a very different desire to fight non-believers or infidels, supporting or defending Muslims around the world in a global jihad. During the decade of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the United States covertly funneled $20 billion into the country to train and arm Afghan resistance troops. And here's the thing, it worked. Just like the United States experienced in Vietnam, the Soviets fell into a protracted and losing war against a highly motivated domestic guerrilla force. By 1982, the Mujahideen controlled most of Afghanistan. And yet, eventually, the Mujahideen began to fracture, breaking into at least 7 distinct factions. Different groups started then receiving funding from around the world. They were less interested in defeating the Soviets than supporting this other project of global jihad. Perhaps most notable was the contribution of a member of a wealthy family from Saudi Arabia. His name was Osama bin Laden, and he became an important organizer, bringing money, arms, and fighters into Afghanistan. And when the mighty Red Army finally withdrew, one of the groups bin Laden supported became part of the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. And of course, the other factions of the Mujahideen later transformed into the Taliban, who went on to govern Afghanistan under their very strict and brutal version of Islamic law. As a scholar of the era highlights, this ultimately led to what can be called blowback against the United States. With the active encouragement of the CIA, who wanted to turn the Afghan jihad into a global war waged by all Muslim states against the Soviet Union, with 35,000 Muslim radicals from 40 Islamic countries joined Afghanistan's fight between 1982 and 1992. Eventually, more than 100,000 foreign Muslim radicals were directly influenced by the Afghan jihad. These same radicals, while perhaps supported by the United States to fight the Soviets, soon turned their attention to the West. As the international relations scholar Fred Halliday also explains, I always tell my Islamist friends, when they complain about Western hostility, that the largest covert operation in the history of the CIA was mounted in support of an Islamic fundamentalist coalition in Afghanistan. For that, they should at least be grateful. And, as the investigative journalist Christian Parente reveals in his article, America's Jihad, A History of Origins, written soon after the start of the war, to understand America's new war on terror, we must examine the role of the United States in nurturing the same Islamic military networks that are now global enemy number 1. All told, the American effort to fight their primary enemy, the Soviet Union, led them to help facilitate the birth of their new enemy. As the foreign policy article mentioned earlier summarizes, over the ensuing years, bin Laden was involved in one way or the other in various terrorist attacks around the world, including the bombing of American embassies in Africa and U.S. military barracks in Saudi Arabia. In fact, bin Laden was particularly incensed about the presence of American military bases in Saudi Arabia, which were constructed during and after the Persian Gulf War. The Americans saw these bases as critical to maintain their influence in the region. As bin Laden makes clear, in this rare interview from 1997, he wants the American infidels out of the Arabian Peninsula and to overthrow the Saudi royal family, who he argues must be punished for allowing Americans on sacred Muslim territory. Also citing American support of Israel, bin Laden explains his declaration of jihad against the United States government.
You have declared a jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
The US government has committed acts that are extremely unjust, hideous, and criminal through its support of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And we believe the US is directly responsible for those killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq. Due to its subordination to the Jews, the arrogance of the United States regime has reached the point that they occupied Arabia, the holiest place of the Muslims, who are more than 1 billion people in the world today. For this and other acts of aggression and injustice, we have declared jihad against the US.
Is the jihad directed against the US government or United States troops in Arabia? What about U.S. civilians in Arabia or the people of the United States?
We have focused our declaration of jihad on striking at the U.S. soldiers inside Arabia, the country of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina. In our religion, it is not permissible for any non-Muslim to stay in Arabia. Therefore, even though American civilians are not targeted in our plan, they must leave. We do not guarantee their safety.
Much later, this interview was part of the evidence used to compose the presidential daily briefing for August 6, 2001, over a month before the 9/11 attacks. It was titled, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. The authors of this brief also warned Al-Qaeda members, including some who are U.S. citizens, have resided in or traveled to the United States for years, and the group apparently maintains support structures that could aid attacks. Obviously, these warnings were not heeded, and the Americans failed to expose and stop the 9/11 attack plan, which is described in detail in the 9/11 Commission report. In section 1 of my presentation, I've argued that the 9/11 attacks were an extension or the fallout of events that occurred decades before. Now for your first question assignment. Was the blowback of the September 11th attacks a necessary consequence of the United States' early efforts to confront and contain the Soviet Union? Please refer to the course outline for detailed instructions and due dates. Your main objective is to provide a 500-word answer. I encourage you to use the sources mentioned in my presentation, but also feel free to do your own research. Email me with any questions. I look forward to seeing your work.